Hello, everybody. I'm Jamie Metzl, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our workshop on the World Health Organization report on human genetic engineering. And I'm tremendously pleased and honored to be with my colleague, Jantina DeVries, who I've just butchered her name, but I hope it was close enough, who was a fellow member of the WHO committee, and Dr. Bonginkosi Shozi, who was not a member of our committee, but who's deeply thoughtful about these critically important issues. I know that there were two other members of our panel who were promised, and they're on the way, but we are, I think this should make clear that while technology is in many ways magic, allowing us to be together from around the world through this virtual medium, it doesn't always work exactly how we intended to do. And I think that's an important lead-in to our conversation today, because while humanity now suddenly has these incredible, I would say even godlike tools in many ways to read, write, and hack the code of life, the question is, and particularly over time as these technologies become more powerful, is can we do so wisely? Can we have frameworks, not that prevent the application of these technologies that have the potential to be extremely helpful, but to allow us to apply our most cherished values toward guiding our applications of our most powerful technologies. That was the charge of our World Health Organization committee when Dr. Tedros, the WHO Director General, and our friends at the World Health Organization put that committee together. As a matter of fact, the committee was called into being very soon after the announcement in November 2018 by the Chinese biophysicist He Jiankui that the world's first two, at that time, CRISPR babies, genome edited babies with a single gene mutation change, had been born in China, and a third was later born. And I think for everybody, we realized that a line had been crossed, and maybe that line was always going to be crossed, but it happened far sooner than many or most of us were prepared for. And it made us recognize that we needed to think much more deeply about governance, about how we can build the most responsible framework around these kinds of technologies that have such profound implications for who and what we are as human beings. And so our group was pulled together not as an effort to stop the application of these technologies forever, but to think deeply about how we can build those kinds of frameworks. And while the technology and the science were what brought us to the point of even having the conversation, ultimately, the conversation was and is about ethics and about values. And the mismatch that we experience in this world is that these technologies are advancing exponentially, but our regulatory understanding of them, our regulatory infrastructures and governance infrastructures to manage them wisely, those I can't possibly keep up because societal norms, regulations, they happen much more slowly than the speed of exponential science. And so what our committee was trying to do over the 2 years that we worked leading up to our report was talk in broad principle about the framework that we think would be most effective to help ensure the most beneficial applications of these technologies and preventing the worst abuses. We didn't have the answers, but we thought we could start a process for creating the kinds of models and frameworks that could lead toward the best possible outcome. So with that, let me hand over to Jantina to talk a little bit about our committee and our work.
Excellent, thank you, Jamie. And I recognize that we are even further hindered by our inability to work the technology because we had some slides prepared. Let me go ahead and present without slides. So, as Jamie indicated, we spent about 2 years discussing kind of a whole range of issues around genome editing, human germline genome editing, as well as somatic genome editing. And in that time, both discussed where we thought we should strike kind of ideas around a governance framework, but also who needs to step into the space of regulating and considering human germline genome editing. And I think it's fair to say we are now joined by Edwin. Hello. So Edwin is
Hi, everyone.
another.
Lovely to be with you. I was hearing you all and so proud of Jamie and Jantina for stepping in. I could hear you all, but I was barred. Lovely to see you, Bongi. And Jantina, sorry for interrupting. I'm thrilled to be here with you.
Excellent. Wonderful. So Edwin Cameron was the co-chair of the panel, together with Dr. Margaret Hamburg from the United States. We were composed of a group of about 20 people, really quite geographically representative, I think, of different areas of the globe. I think it's fair to say, in terms of thinking through the work that we've done and thinking through what you might be most interested to hear, that we thought that there are 2 or 3 really key areas that are very important for how we think about the global regulation of human germline and somatic genome editing. And those are, first of all, the central principle of equity. So thinking through how we ensure that everybody across the world has equal access or at least a fair opportunity to benefit from human genome editing. The second really is an emphasis on public consultation lying at the heart of anything that goes through or anything in terms of how we regulate genome editing, but also how we develop innovations going forward. The governance framework that we developed, and all of that information is publicly available, obviously, draws on a very large range of tools and instruments that governments can use to edit genomes or to regulate genome editing. But most important, I think, is at the heart of all the work we did was a set of ethical principles and values that target both how decisions are made, but also what decisions are made. And those of you in the ethics or legal realm will recognize different ideas about justice incorporated in how we divide our ethical principles. Amongst those were typical values like openness and transparency, honesty and accountability, but also, and I think I already alluded to this, an emphasis on social justice, fairness and solidarity. And those, I think you will see if you engage with some of the documents that we developed, are really informing a lot of how this panel at least thought we should approach genome editing going forward. What we did as part of the work is describe how we think particular challenges in genome editing ought to be regulated through the use of scenarios. And those scenarios both demonstrate how the principles and the governance framework itself together in practice, but they also illustrate practical challenges around regulation of genome editing with a view of ensuring that any regulation of genome editing isn't too narrow, and because the technology is advancing very rapidly. So a forward-looking and innovative, I think, approach to thinking about the regulation of new and emerging health technologies. Those scenarios cover things like clinical trials for sickle cell disease and Huntington's, but also unscrupulous entrepreneurs. And you might be aware of equivalents in stem cell regulation, the use of stem cells, for instance, where some parties were rather unscrupulous in their marketing of alleged cures for things that really can't be cured yet. Our recommendations, so we have a set of recommendations, and I think collectively what those recommendations do is place the emphasis on the importance both of international consensus and regulation. So several of those recommendations speak to the importance of these technologies, and it's not exclusive, of course, to genome editing, but also other emerging health technologies, for there to be a process or an entity, I guess a process of global consultation and global regulation, even if not through laws, for instance, then certainly through commitments or moratoria or agreed principles for innovation, for instance. The other main recommendation, I think, and that was very much informed by everything that was happening around the COVID pandemic, I think, was an invitation or an encouragement for the leadership at the WHO and its Director General to really lead in this space. So and this is a role that WHO has not traditionally taken, I think, but to very much engage in ethical leadership of innovation in the health space and in the space of new and emerging health technologies. There were then also, there was a range of recommendations, and I'm kind of being a little bit selective in thinking through what we think might be most relevant to the South African audience. The committee recommended that there ought to be an international registry specifically tracking clinical trials that involve either clinical trials of somatic genome editing that involve patients as one approach to ensuring some form of accountability and transparency in the sector. The other the other thing that we really recommended was that there ought to be a way to monitor and understand if and when germline genome editing starts to happen, and even if the registry doesn't quite tackle this now, this is kind of where it might be heading. The committee was quite concerned about the potential that some of these trials and some of this research would actually target people in areas where there is no regulation. And so we toyed with different terms, and particularly Jamie and I think, had a lot of toing and froing around the concepts that should be applied to how we think about the international regulation of research and medical travel. And we strongly feel that it's really imperative that both countries develop their own regulations, and I'm sure Bongi has something to say on what can happen in the South African space, but also that countries discourage and funders discourage the use of or the application of innovations in countries that do not have regulations. And something like that is happening already with the European Commission, for instance, where one cannot use European research funds to conduct research that is not permitted for a European country. And I think as a model, we found that very inspirational. And finally, the recommendation that I would then pick out is the emphasis on education, engagement, and empowerment. So both kind of the outputs of the committee, but also at the core of all of our approach, I would say, was an attempt and a recognition that as many different peoples and cultures we have around the world, as many different voices we should have around the table in thinking through particularly something as radical as germline genome editing going forward. That is a very kind of brief overview through some of the work and inputs that we've had. Jamie, shall I hand over to you?
Yeah, no. So Edwin, if you'd be willing, you're our leader and our hero. Yeah, good. To talk just a little bit. I mean, what we were trying to do is to think broadly about what is governance, and in many ways, how do we think about governance without any of the structures or institutions in place that you would have within a single country if you just decided you were going to regulate something. So if you could just talk a little bit based on your experience, both in South Africa, but also globally, about how you and we are thinking about governance when we're at the early stages of this arc of developing this potentially radical technology.
Jamie, the global institutions and mechanisms of governance are neither linear nor they're hierarchical. So we have had to, in this committee, deal with a very complex set of normative recommendations, of recognizing the regional and the country-specific differences in relation to governance. Some countries have highly developed responses to this innovation. Others have barely touched it. So our recommendations are very sensitive to the fact that all across the globe there are very different stages of response to human genetic engineering. Governance, obviously, Jamie, WHO does not have the power nor the wish to impose a set of norms, to impose a moratorium, to impose a set of inhibitions. But it's very, very clear, for all the reasons Jantina has already given, that we have to tread carefully, we have to tread slowly, and as Jantina indicated, we have to be careful of the gangsters, the chancers, and the others who are moving into the area. So governance, to answer the question that you threw at me most welcomely, but unexpectedly, governance means a set of norms and preferably a set of enforceable norms which govern behavior. And in this case, we, as you'll see from our report, it ranges from peer pressure, from peer allocation of funding, to criminal inhibitions, which exist, for example, in China, and I think in Japan. So it's a whole range of different responses by authority-bearing and power-bearing institutions and persons to set human genetic engineering on the right road in particular jurisdictions and regions.
That's great, Edwin. I think it's so important what you've raised, because traditionally we think of governance as enforceable norms, but because this is a global issue, how do we think of enforcement without, in many cases, an enforcer? And while there are some countries that have stronger regulatory environments, you mentioned some, China didn't have one sufficiently when these first CRISPR babies were born, and then after the fact imposed one even retroactively. But then there are black holes, regulatory black holes, like we have with stem cell, where people go to various countries to get work that's done on them that's probably unsafe and banned in many other places. And that brings me to my questions for you, Bongi, as part of our consultations, actually just before the pandemic hit in February of 2020, our committee met in Cape Town. And we had, it was, in my mind, probably the most profound of our meetings, because we met, and thanks to Jantina, helped organize this with some really incredible people, including representatives of the San community and others, where it was clear that there were different conversations that were happening in different places around the world. When we spoke about human genome editing, and we were speaking about it with a certain perspective and a certain context. And the San people who we met were extremely thoughtful, but just coming from a very, very different place. And so when bringing back to what Edwin said about creating norms, and Jantina said about inclusion and having, if we're talking about something that is an integrated global, ideally, governance system that is inclusive, that empowers people, so it's not happening to people, but by people, how do we think about the process of inclusion? And so, Bongi, from your experience and your reflections on the work of the committee and more broadly, what are your thoughts?
Thank you, Jamie. That's an excellent question and leads quite well to what I wanted to really discuss and bring to the fore in the context of this workshop. the WHO had honestly an unenviable task here, because trying to standard set at a global level something that is so steeped in questions of norms and principles is extremely difficult, because we understand that things like norms and principles aren't universal. What might be seen as an important ethical value in one place, like autonomy, which is considered traditionally a very important norm in Western contexts, might not be equally weighted and valued in non-Western contexts, like in the African philosophical tradition or in Asian bioethics or Confucian ethics, to be more particular. And so that's sort of the difficulty that the WHO had to confront. And I think you guys did a very impressive job of recognizing this reality and trying to put forward a series of recommendations that also left sufficient space for individual countries and individual, institutions to infuse in whatever governance they develop the norms and values that are important to them and to their own people. Because there are particular communities that are usually affected by technologies but rarely have a say in the course of the development of those technologies and how the eventual technology is regulated. You talked about the San community, and that's a great example of this. You look at that community and the amount of valuable genomics research that's come from them, crazily disproportionate to any other population in the world. And yet, how much say have the San people had in how that technology is developed and how it's used? And it just shows that there's often an injustice in questions of governance, because the people who contribute the most, they rarely have the most to say. And so with the WHO governance framework and it bringing it to the fore the importance of inclusiveness and the importance of a wider discourse, I think has taken the correct steps to recognizing that context varies, values are weighed differently, principles are looked at from different perspectives, and also giving, like I said, individual states and other similar organizations that might have a say on how gene editing is regulated, giving them that space to say, well, we might depart from what others consider the norm because of valuable context-specific factors. And there's a number of examples that one could bring up that, might be a position where different countries vary. Often raised example is with heritable genome editing, and the idea that, well, many people have expressed that heritable genome editing is fundamentally unethical and something that should never be pursued because there's no real ethical impetus for it. And people from the global south have responded by saying, well, in our context, there are potentially ethically justifiable applications. For example, if we face epidemics of viruses like tuberculosis, malaria, HIV, infectious diseases, if parents want to have the option of ensuring that their children are not exposed to these epidemics, that's arguably an ethically justifiable use of that technology. And that's just one example of how values and norms can vary, and that influences how governance is different. And so the WHO governance framework, I think, is an important first step for countries like South Africa that don't have specific regulation for gene editing, but it's not the end of the process. And I think carrying out those values entails countries think deeply about how their people look at these technologies, what their needs are, and how that might translate into variance in how they regulate gene editing within that particular country.
Yeah, and I think that's such an essential point. It was absolutely central to what we did, but we see this work as just the very, very, very beginning. And it's not, our view is not that there can just be one treaty that, or anything that solves this once and for all, but we need to have an ongoing process that's guided by core values. And that was why education, engagement, and empowerment was so essential. It's not just inviting people to meetings. It's making sure that everybody in the world, particularly the most vulnerable and disadvantaged people, have the information that they need, are part of the process, and are empowered at every level to make sure that they feel, and that we all feel, that the process reflects who and what we are. And that makes things a lot more complicated because there's so many different voices and perspectives, but without it, we really will have nothing. Jantina, we just have a few more minutes. I wanted to get your reflections on these issues of engagement and inclusion. Yep, you're on mute.
So thanks for those reflections. Very briefly, so I couldn't agree more. I also think you got me a bit off guard there. Mm-hmm. I think that's really important. I think it's also very important that engagement and empowerment and inclusion are genuine and not transactional. And I think that is partly a risk, right? Is that as much as we prioritize the needs of the vulnerable, for instance, for them to, and I think Bongi was getting at this, for them to really have a voice and an influence in the direction of innovation is something altogether different. And so, my 2 cents worth is that this is only the start, and actually kind of transformative inclusion for how we do business is something that none of us, I think, have quite grasped, and where we need to head.
Yeah, I think that's excuse me. I think that's a core takeaway for all of us. And I apologize for throwing what we call in baseball lingo curveballs to everybody, but I feel like we're getting great and additional content. And so as we approach the end of this session, first. I hope that everybody, thank you to Bongi and Jantina and Edwin and Katherine, who's with us in absentia from the WHO. And I hope that everybody will read the report, and I will send Mick a link to the report to be shared with everybody at the summit. Edwin's condition for participating in this event from the beginning was that this conversation be shared broadly, including with the general public. So Mick has agreed that we will do that. And then perhaps most importantly, although there was a small group of us who were selected to work on this report, what we're talking about is the future of all of us. Everybody is the author of the report of our future as individuals, as families, as communities, and our species. And my hope is that we can all be part of not just empowering and engaging ourselves, but working to spread that circle, to help engage and empower and include others. And that is the ultimate team effort. So would like then just to hand it over to my dear friend, Edwin, for just a few final remarks before we close.
Jamie, thank you so much. It's been a great event and a great privilege to be part of the Singularity University of South Africa presentation of workshops. I think that you've set the challenges very boldly. The challenges lie with each of us. And the challenge you've set really is a deeper challenge to all of us in your home country, the United States, in our home country, South Africa, to get involved and to take responsibility for our future at every level. The WHO Human Genetic Engineering report offers involvement. It's the beginning, as you said earlier, it's not the end. And we hope that across the world, from many different regions and countries, people will get involved and accept your challenge to write the report of our future. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.